The screech of tires against wet asphalt was the only warning. 2 tons of luxury, armored steel locked its brakes, stopping mere inches from the boy's knees. Through the golden haze of the streetlights and the driving rain, the bodyguards saw him. A fragile kid in an oversized hoodie, his arms thrown wide open as if his tiny frame could physically hold back a Mafia convoy. He wasn't moving. He was screaming, his voice raw with a terror that cut straight through the storm. "Please, don't let them take my brother." Inside the black sedan sat Minseog Byeon, an apex predator in a tailored overcoat whose very name made the city's criminal underground hold its breath. The protocol for an ambush was simple: neutralize the threat. The bodyguards drew their weapons, lunging forward into the rain. But before a single shot could be fired, the impossible happened. Minseog raised his hand, and what the most ruthless man in the city did next didn't just break his own rules, it shattered his entire empire. To understand why the crew froze, you have to understand who they were protecting. Minseog Byeon didn't make mistakes. He didn't make exceptions, and he certainly didn't stop for strays. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a gaze that could freeze blood, Minseog was the architect of an invisible, flawless machine. His syndicate operated with terrifying precision, from the polished black leather of his dress shoes to the pristine white collar beneath his dark overcoat. Every inch of the man projected absolute, untouchable control. Emotion was a liability. Mercy was a death sentence. For years, where he had survived at the top of the food chain by carving out the part of his heart that could still feel pity. Tonight was supposed to be like any other. A swift exit from headquarters. A silent ride through his meticulously guarded territory. But as Minseog sat in the dim light of the sedan, staring out at the rain-soaked kid refusing to back down from the barrels of 3 guns, something shifted. The boy wasn't just begging. He was standing his ground against monsters to protect his blood. It was a raw, desperate courage that Minseog hadn't seen in decades. The pause hung in the heavy, wet air. The dominant man hadn't yet reacted. The entire story, and the fate of 2 brothers, hung completely on the next breath he took. Stay with me until the end. Because what starts as a desperate plea in the rain is about to uncover a betrayal so deep, it will force the city's most powerful man to burn his own empire to the ground. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Mafia Chronicles, and comment below where you're listening from. Minseog Byeon did not rule the city's underworld through mindless violence. He ruled it through architectural precision. To look at him was to look at a man who had surgically removed his own capacity for hesitation. His presence alone was enough to suffocate a room. Standing broad-shouldered in his tailored suits and sweeping dark overcoats, Minseog possessed the cold, calculating stillness of a heavy vault door sliding shut. He demanded nothing less than absolute perfection, and in return, the sprawling criminal syndicate he commanded operated like the gears of a complex watch. His inner circle reflected this relentless discipline. The men who flanked him were not mere street thugs. They were highly trained, impeccably dressed enforcers who moved with predatory silence. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They didn't act without a direct command. A single twitch of Minseog's jaw, a subtle shift in his polished black leather shoes, or a momentary narrowing of his dark eyes was all it took for a rival enterprise to be dismantled before dawn. His bodyguards were extensions of his own will, lethal, efficient, and entirely devoid of sentiment. In Minseog's world, there was no room for error, and certainly no room for the messy, unpredictable nature of human emotion. Compassion was a liability. Pity was a crack in the foundation. He had spent years transforming his empire into a flawless, emotionless fortress, purging anyone who let their heart dictate their trigger finger. He firmly believed that as long as he maintained this iron grip, as long as the machine remained perfectly oiled and insulated from the chaotic suffering of the streets, he was untouchable. Yet, all that meticulous planning, all that rigid, unbreakable order was currently being defied by 40 pounds of soaking wet desperation. The fortress he had built was invincible against bullets, rival syndicates, and federal indictments, but it had no protocol for a terrified 10-year-old boy. As the rain battered the hood of the armored sedan, Minseog stared through the glass. His flawless machine had ground to a violently sudden halt, its gears jammed by the sheer, undeniable force of a child's breaking heart. The downpour felt like sheets of ice against the pavement, but the sudden eruption of chaos was blisteringly hot. It happened in the span of a single heartbeat, as Minseog stood by the open rear door of his idling sedan, preparing to slip into the quiet sanctuary of the leather interior. A small, ragged blur darted out from the mouth of a pitch-black alleyway. It was Greg. The boy didn't trip, didn't hesitate, and didn't shrink away from the blinding glare of the headlights. He threw himself directly into the narrow space between the imposing Mafia boss and the vehicle, planting his cheap mud-caked sneakers onto the wet asphalt. Instantly, the street exploded into disciplined, terrifying violence. Minseog's security detail reacted not with shock, but with lethal ingrained muscle memory. The muscular, stocky bodyguard closest to the door lunged forward, a wall of aggression in a dark suit, his massive hand sweeping out to violently rip the perceived threat away from his boss. A second enforcer, positioned just a few steps back, dropped seamlessly into a tactical stance, the sharp metallic clack of a sidearm being drawn, slicing cleanly through the heavy sound of the rain. They didn't see a terrified child. Their conditioning only registered an unpredictable anomaly breaching the absolute perimeter. To them, the boy was a variable that needed to be neutralized, brutally and immediately. Yet, caught beneath the towering shadows of trained killers and the gleaming steel of the armored sedan, the child refused to break. Greg's fragile frame heaved violently beneath his oversized soaked hoodie, while he threw both of his skinny arms straight upward, his bare palms facing the giants surrounding him in a universal gesture of defenselessness. He leaned back slightly, his face twisted in visceral, undeniable panic, his eyes squinting against the stinging rain and the terrifying reality of the men bearing down on him. But he did not step aside. He anchored his weight, weaponizing his own vulnerability to form a human barricade. Over the low, menacing growl of the car's engine and the aggressive shouts of the advancing guards, the boy's voice tore through the night, raw and bleeding with desperation. "Please, they're taking him. Don't let them take my brother." He was a mouse, screaming into the jaws of a lion, armed with nothing but an unyielding, desperate courage. The bodyguard's massive hand was mere inches from the boy's collar, poised to violently hurl him onto the wet asphalt. The metallic scrape of a slide being racked cut through the relentless drumming of the rain. Time seemed to fracture, hanging suspended in the breathless void just before a kill. But in that violently compressed second, Minseog Byeon did not give the order to strike. Instead, his dark, calculating eyes locked onto the anomaly blocking his path. He didn't see the calculated stance of a rival assassin or the nervous twitch of an undercover federal agent. He saw a child, frail and soaked to the bone, radiating a raw, blinding terror that no amount of acting could fake. Slowly, deliberately, Minseog raised a single gloved hand. The gesture was completely silent, yet it struck the street with the force of a detonating bomb. The stocky bodyguard froze, his outstretched arm locking into rigid obedience millimeters from Greg's face. Behind him, the enforcer with the drawn weapon instantly lowered the barrel, though his eyes darted wildly, scanning the shadows for a trap. To halt a defensive maneuver mid-strike was a direct violation of every protocol Minseog had ever drilled into his men. It was an impossible hesitation from a man who never hesitated. The crew exchanged imperceptible glances, profound shock rippling through their highly disciplined ranks. Ignoring the silent confusion of his elite guard, Minseog did something even more unprecedented. He didn't retreat into the armored sanctuary of the sedan. Instead, he stepped fully out from beneath the protective overhang of the open car door, letting the icy downpour soak into the broad shoulders of his expensive, tailored overcoat. The rain instantly matted his dark, neatly slicked-back hair, but his towering, grounded posture remained absolute. He closed the short distance between them, his polished leather shoes splashing softly against the flooded pavement, until he was looming directly over the trembling boy. The city's most dangerous man stared down at the defenseless child. His hardened facial features were entirely devoid of warmth, yet they held a sudden, intense focus that pinned the boy in place. The street seemed to go dead quiet, the tension swallowing the ambient noise of the storm. "Speak," Minseog commanded, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that cut perfectly through the rain. "Who took him?" The boy was shivering too violently to form words over the howling wind. Minseog's dark eyes narrowed slightly, chi evaluating the raw terror and adrenaline flooding the child's fragile frame. Without breaking eye contact, the towering boss reached forward. He didn't strike. Instead, his gloved hand clamped firmly onto the scruff of the boy's soaked, oversized hoodie. With effortless, terrifying strength, Minseog hauled Greg out of the freezing downpour and deposited him directly onto the pristine, cream-colored leather of the sedan's back seat. The heavy armored door slammed shut behind them, instantly severing the roar of the storm. The sudden, suffocating silence inside the cabin was heavy, smelling of expensive cologne, rich leather, and wet asphalt. Greg scrambled backward against the opposite door, his mud-caked sneakers ruining the immaculate upholstery. He stared at the mountain of a man settling into the seat beside him, his breath hitching. They took him from our alley," Greg stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as rainwater dripped from his chin. "He told them we didn't have the quota yet. They hit him with a pipe. They dragged him into his rusted van." Minseog's expression remained a mask of carved stone, absorbing the frantic information without a flicker of empathy. "Who?" he asked, his voice a quiet, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Greg swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a terrified, breathless whisper. "The Jackals." The name hung in the climate-controlled air. The Jackals were bottom feeders, parasitic scavengers who preyed on the city's forgotten edges and trafficked in human misery. They were supposed to be entirely beneath Minseog's notice, operating in the filthy gutters while he controlled the skyline. Yet, free looking at the trembling creature beside him, a boy who had willingly stepped into the crosshairs of the city's deadliest syndicate just to buy his older brother a sliver of a chance. Minseog felt an unfamiliar, sharp sensation pierce through his carefully constructed emotional armor. It wasn't pity. It was a dark, profound respect. In an underworld built on purchased loyalty, fake smiles, and cowardly betrayals, this filthy street kid possessed the exact kind of fearless, uncorrupted devotion Minseog demanded from his empire, but rarely received. Slowly, Minseog shifted his gaze away from the boy, looking toward the thick, bulletproof partition separating them from the front seats. He pressed the silver intercom button. When he spoke, his voice was no longer an inquiry. It was an executioner's gavel. "Tell the detail we are altering the route," Minseog commanded, his tone dripping with absolute icy authority. "Open the armory trunks. We are hunting jackals tonight." Through the rain-streaked glass, Greg watched in awe as the towering suited men outside instantly shifted their posture, transforming from a defensive escort into a heavily armed strike team preparing for an unsanctioned war. The convoy tore through the rain-slicked streets of the city, a procession of sleek black metal moving with lethal coordinated purpose. Inside the armored sanctuary of the flagship Sedan, the silence was absolute. A heavy, suffocating pressure broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the engine and the faint chilling sounds bleeding through the encrypted radio channel. Over the speakers, the cold, mechanical clack of assault rifles being chambered and the heavy snick of tactical magazines locking into place painted a violent picture of the storm gathering around them. Minseog's elite strike team was gearing up for war, their terrifying efficiency a stark contrast to the small, shivering Anomaly curled up on the opposite side of the cream-colored leather seat. Greg hugged his bony knees to his chest, his oversized, soaked hoodie leaving a dark, damp stain on the pristine upholstery. He stared blankly at the floorboards, his teeth occasionally clicking together from the cold. "He didn't fight back right away," the boy whispered, his voice trembling but laced with a fierce protective pride. "He told me to run. He always tells me to run when the Jackals come sniffing around. He said he'd handle the quota." He promised. Minseog remained perfectly still, his broad shoulders resting against the seat. His sharply defined face betrayed nothing, but his dark eyes remained locked on the boy's reflection in the rain-streaked window. As the neon lights of the city blurred past the tinted glass, the impenetrable walls of the Mafia boss's psyche began to fracture. Looking at the boy's bruised knuckles and desperate hollow eyes, Minseog did not see a filthy street kid. He saw a ghost. Decades ago, before the tailored suits and the terrifying empire, Minseog had been just another disposable orphan bleeding in the gutters. He remembered the biting, relentless cold. He remembered the paralyzing fear of being hunted by men who viewed children as nothing more than currency. To survive that world, Minseog had systematically murdered his own innocence, replacing his heart with a ruthless, calculating machine. He had become the monster to stop the monsters. Yet here was Greg, equally broken and hunted, refusing to surrender his humanity. The boy hadn't hardened his heart. He had weaponized his love, throwing his fragile body in front of a moving armored vehicle to save the only family he had left. The realization settled heavy in Minseog's chest. The air in the cabin grew colder, as the salty metallic scent of the nearby docks began to seep through the climate-controlled vents. The flawless architect of order was no longer just answering an insult to his territory. He was answering a debt to his own forgotten past. The convoy killed its headlights 3 blocks away from the sprawling industrial graveyard of the shipping yards. Shrouded in the torrential downpour, the black sedans glided to a halt behind a towering wall of rusted stacked containers. The rhythmic sweeping of the windshield wipers ceased, leaving only the deafening roar of the storm and the suffocating scent of salt water, wet iron, and decay. Inside the cabin, Minseog turned his dark, evaluating gaze toward Greg. He didn't offer a word of hollow comfort, only a cold, absolute command to stay hidden on the floorboards, pulling his expensive overcoat tightly around himself as he stepped back into the deluge. Minseog stood broad-shouldered and imposing against the grim backdrop of the docks, a king descending into the gutters. With a single, sharp motion of his leather-clad hand, he unleashed the hounds. His elite strike team dissolved into the shadows like smoke. There was no chaotic charging, no macho posturing. Minseog's men operated with the terrifying, surgical precision of a scalpel cutting through rot. They moved through the labyrinth of metal corridors in total silence, their dark suits blending seamlessly with the pitch-black night. They were hunting the Jackals, street-level scavengers who Minseog expected to be undisciplined, sloppy, and completely unprepared for the apex predators now stalking them. The outer perimeter takedown was a masterclass in silent brutality. Through the heavy sheets of rain, Minseog watched with emotionless detachment as the first guard, huddled beneath a flickering amber sodium light, was neutralized. A muscular silhouette stepped flawlessly from the guard's blind spot. A gloved hand clamped fiercely over the man's mouth, followed immediately by the muffled, sickening crunch of a tactical strike. The limp body was dragged effortlessly into the black abyss between 2 cargo crates before the guard's dropped cigarette even sizzled out on the wet asphalt. Across the flooded yard, the sequence repeated in perfectly synchronized, soundless choreography. Knives glinted briefly in the ambient light. Heavy boots stepped over neutralized threats without a single wasted movement or whispered curse. Not a single gunshot fractured the night. The Jackals' outer defenses were systematically and violently dismantled without the core of the operation ever realizing they were under siege. Minseog advanced slowly down the newly cleared path, his polished leather shoes stepping cleanly around the fallen bodies of the men who had dared to touch a child in his city. He approached the massive corrugated steel doors of the main holding warehouse, expecting to breach the sanctuary of a disorganized gang of street thugs. He drew his weapon, utterly unaware that his flawless, untouchable empire was about to crack wide open. The heavy corrugated steel door stood as the final barrier between the storm and the syndicate's prey. Minseog did not wait for his men to set tactical charges. Stepping forward, he raised a polished leather shoe and struck the rusted locking mechanism with the devastating force of a battering ram. The hinges screamed in violent protest as the massive door slammed inward, the deafening metallic crash echoing like a gunshot through the cavernous space. Instantly, banks of harsh industrial halogen lights snapped on, flooding the sprawling warehouse in a blinding, sterile white glare. Minseog crossed the threshold with his weapon raised, his broad shoulders and dark overcoat cutting a terrifying silhouette against the driving rain behind him. His elite strike team poured in seamlessly, a wave of dark, lethal precision fanning out across the damp concrete to secure the perimeter and neutralize the scavengers. In the dead center of the room, anchored beneath the blinding lights, sat Greg's older brother. He was brutally bound to a metal chair with thick industrial zip ties. His face was a canvas of fresh bruises, his clothes torn, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked exactly like the helpless broken victim of a street-level gang that Minseog had expected to find. But as Minseog's vision adjusted to the abrasive light, his dark, calculating eyes locked onto the figure standing casually over the bleeding teenager. The man didn't flinch at the explosive breach. He didn't scramble for a cheap rusted weapon or cower in the shadows like a bottom-feeding jackal. Instead, he slowly turned around, the fluorescent glare catching the immaculate tailored cut of a familiar charcoal suit and the distinct glint of a custom gold watch. The breath in Minseog's lungs instantly turned to ice. It was not a street thug. It was Elias, his own underboss, his most trusted lieutenant, the man who managed the syndicate's eastern shipping routes and sat quietly at his right hand during every high-level meeting. The flawless, emotionless fortress Minseog had spent decades constructing did not just crack in that microscopic moment, it pulverized into dust. The horrifying truth crashed over him with the suffocating weight of a collapsing building. There was no rival gang. The Jackals were a ghost story, a convenient, filthy front designed to keep the boss looking the other way. His own men were the traffickers. They were using his secured docks, his laundered money, and his terrifying, untouchable reputation to harvest the city's forgotten children right under his nose. Minseog stared at the man he had personally trained, the man he had trusted with the keys to his empire. The absolute, ironclad control he had always prided himself on was nothing but a hollow, sickening illusion. He had built a flawless machine, only to realize the gears were dripping with the exact innocent blood he had sworn to never touch. Elias did not raise his hands in surrender. Instead, he offered a slow, chillingly calm smile, his eyes flickering past Minseog to the strike team fanning out inside the room. The heavy silence in the warehouse suddenly shifted. It no longer felt like the quiet aftermath of a perfect tactical breach. It felt like a trap. The momentum of the violent breach evaporated into a suffocating, toxic stillness. Minseog Byeon, a man who had never hesitated in his entire ruthless life, froze. The barrel of his weapon remained locked dead center on Elias's chest, but the lethal certainty that normally guided his trigger finger was suddenly clouded by a creeping, icy dread. Elias didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't break a sweat under the abrasive halogen lights. He merely adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his calm, calculating gaze flicking from the boss he had betrayed to the heavily armed strike team currently fanning out across the damp concrete behind Minseog. That single, confident glance from his lieutenant was a psychological earthquake. Minseog's pulse, not usually a slow, methodical drum, spiked. The tactical math was instantaneous and horrifying. Elias could not run a shadow trafficking operation of this massive scale alone. He needed logistics, heavily armed drivers, and perimeter security. He needed the syndicate's finest. The terrifying realization clamped down on Minseog's throat. The traitors weren't just standing in front of him. They were standing right at his back. 6 elite enforcers were positioned behind Minseog in a flawless tactical wedge, their assault rifles raised. A moment ago, they were his absolute, unquestioning sword. Now, they were a firing squad in the dark. In the glaring light of the warehouse, the silence warped into acute, agonizing paranoia. Minseog's peripheral vision strained, his heightened senses dissecting every microscopic detail in the cavernous room. He listened intently to the breathing of his own men over the drumming of the rain outside. He heard a sharp, ragged inhale, the subtle nervous scrape of a tactical boot shifting its weight on the concrete, the metallic microscopic click of a safety being disengaged by someone who wasn't currently aiming at the target in the center of the room. Minseog was trapped in the center of a kill box of his own making. If he shot Elias, the men loyal to the lieutenant would instantly open fire on his back. If he turned to confront his squad, Elias would draw and end him. The untouchable king was suddenly surrounded by wolves wearing his own collars. His flawless, emotionless machine was eating him alive. He could not turn his head. He had to read the allegiances of his crew solely through the tension radiating in the cold air. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the stocky bodyguard to his immediate right, the same man who had lunged at Greg in the rain, imperceptibly lowering the barrel of his rifle toward the floor, refusing to aim at Elias. Treason. To his left, another enforcer's breathing remained slow and steady, his weapon locked fiercely and unwaveringly on the traitorous lieutenant. Loyalty. The warehouse was a rigged powder keg suspended over an open flame, the invisible lines of a Mafia civil war drawn silently across the concrete. A deadly Mexican standoff had paralyzed the room. Minseog's knuckles turned white beneath his leather gloves. He knew the absolute second he twitched, his empire would tear itself apart in a deafening storm of friendly fire. The suffocating silence shattered, not with the crack of gunfire, but with the wet, frantic slap of cheap sneakers against concrete. Greg had disobeyed the absolute command to stay hidden in the armored sedan. Driven by a desperate, blinding need to reach his bleeding brother, the tiny, soaked figure broke past the perimeter and sprinted directly into the illuminated kill box. "Leo!" the boy screamed, his voice tearing through the paranoid stillness of the warehouse. Elias's cold smile widened into a predatory sneer, and the stocky bodyguard to Minseog's right instantly jerked his assault rifle toward the child. That single, fatal flinch was the exact spark the rigged powder keg needed. Minseog Byeon abandoned the cold, flawless architecture of his empire and surrendered entirely to the savage, feral instincts that had kept him alive in the gutters 30 years ago. He moved with a terrifying, explosive violence that completely defied his massive frame. Pivoting on his polished heel, he reached out and violently shoved Greg down behind the sweeping heavy wool of his dark overcoat, turning his own broad body into an impenetrable human shield. Simultaneously, he raised his weapon and fired a single deafening shot point blank into the chest of the stocky traitor. The warehouse erupted into absolute blinding chaos. Gunfire flashed like strobe lights in the abrasive halogen glare, deafening and erratic. The loyal enforcers, instantly recognizing the boss's target, opened fire on the traitors standing within their own ranks. Minseog did not dive for cover. He became a devastating force of nature, an apex predator brutally purging the rot from his own house. Keeping one heavy, the gloved hand pressed fiercely against the back of Greg's trembling head to keep the boy pinned to the damp floor. Minseog fired with ruthless, surgical precision. Every pull of his trigger dismantled a piece of his corrupted legacy. A traitorous guard to his left fell violently backward over a stack of rusted shipping pallets. Another took a lethal round before he could fully raise his weapon, his body dropping heavily to the concrete. The air instantly grew thick with the suffocating acrid stench of cordite, shattered concrete dust, and hot blood. Through the deafening roar of the crossfire, Elias drew a custom sidearm, aiming desperately toward the boss who was currently decimating his rogue squad. Minseog's dark eyes locked onto his former lieutenant. He didn't grant the trafficker the mercy of a quick death. Without breaking his protective stance over the child, Minseog squeezed the trigger, putting a round cleanly through Elias's right shoulder. The underboss collapsed with an agonizing shriek, his weapon clattering uselessly across the floor. Bullets sparked viciously against the corrugated steel walls, whining as they ricocheted through the cavernous space. Yet, Minseog stood his ground, a towering monolith of righteous wrath in the dead center of the storm. He wasn't just fighting to maintain an iron grip on his territory anymore. Sheltering the sobbing, terrified street kid beneath his coat while the last of the traitors fell, The untouchable Mafia boss was violently tearing down his own empire so he could rebuild it on something real. The warehouse was a smoking, blood-slicked ruin, but the mutiny was not entirely extinguished. Through the haze of pulverized concrete and stinging cordite, Minseog's piercing gaze locked onto the center of the room. Leo, Greg's older brother, was still bound tightly to the metal chair, completely exposed in the harsh halogen glare. He was thrashing weakly against the thick industrial zip ties, his terrified eyes wide as stray bullets sparked against the concrete mere inches from his feet. Minseog knew the golden rule of the underworld: never leave cover for a liability. But the rigid, untouchable architect of order had already died the moment he let a crying child into his armored sedan. Gathering the terrified boy huddled beneath his sweeping dark overcoat, Minseog moved. Though he didn't issue commands to his surviving loyalists, he became the vanguard. Hauling Greg firmly against his side, the towering boss advanced through the deafening crossfire with the unstoppable heavy momentum of a freight train. He fired his weapon with lethal, single-handed precision, dropping a wounded traitor who tried to rise from behind a rusted shipping crate. They reached the center of the kill box just as the final desperate gasp of the betrayal unfolded. From the peripheral shadows, a dying enforcer loyal to Elias propped himself up on a shattered knee. His assault rifle was trembling, the barrel sweeping erratically away from the towering Mafia boss and settling directly onto the bruised-bound teenager in the chair. There was no time to adjust his aim. There was no time to issue a kill order. For the first time in his ruthless, heavily guarded life, Minseog Byeon threw himself into the path of a bullet rather than dodging it. He spun his massive frame, shoving Greg violently into his brother's lap, and planted his broad back squarely between the boys and the barrel of the rifle. The gunshot cracked like thunder. A white-hot line of agony ripped across Minseog's left side, the high-caliber round tearing through the expensive wool of his tailored overcoat and grazing his ribs. The sheer kinetic impact staggered the mountain of a man, forcing him down onto one knee against the damp floor. A split second later, a deafening volley of retaliatory fire from Minseog's loyal guards obliterated the sniper in the shadows. Then, absolute, ringing silence fell over the warehouse, broken only by the relentless drumming of the storm against the corrugated steel roof. Minseog did not collapse. Slowly, he raised his head, his breathing heavy and ragged. He looked down at the pristine white dress shirt beneath his coat, now blooming with a dark spreading stain of his own blood. He felt the sharp, unfamiliar sting of physical vulnerability. Yet, as he looked past the blood to see the two brothers clinging desperately to each other, completely unharmed beneath his shadow, Minseog felt no regret. The flawless, emotionless machine was broken, but as the warm blood dripped from his side onto the cold concrete, he had never felt more undeniably human. The deafening echoes of the final volley faded into a heavy, suffocating silence, leaving only the relentless drumming of the storm against the corrugated steel roof. Minseog Byeon slowly pushed himself up from the damp floor. He ignored the burning agony radiating from his ribs and the dark blood soaking his pristine white shirt. His surviving loyalists secured the perimeter, their weapons lowered, their eyes fixed on their wounded boss. But Minseog was not looking at them. His dark, dead eyes were locked entirely on the shattered figure, crawling frantically across the blood-slicked concrete. Elias was clutching his ruined shoulder, leaving a thick smeared trail of crimson as he backed himself into the corner of a rusted shipping container. His tailored charcoal suit was destroyed, his confident smirk replaced by a mask of raw, pathetic terror. The polished black leather of Minseog's shoes stepped methodically over the bodies of the fallen traitors, the slow, rhythmic splash of his boots in the flooded puddles, sounding like the ticking of an executioner's clock. Minseog came to a halt, his massive, a broad-shouldered silhouette entirely blotting out the abrasive halogen glare. He stared down at his former underboss, the barrel of his sidearm hanging loosely at his side. He didn't yell. When he finally spoke, his voice was a chilling, gravelly whisper that carried the terrifying weight of absolute zero. "I built this empire to rise above the filth of the gutters we bled in, Elias," Minseog began, his tone devoid of any human warmth. "I gave you power. I gave you structure. I gave you an invisible, flawless machine that ruled the skyline, but you couldn't resist crawling back into the mud." Elias coughed violently, spitting blood onto the concrete. "Minseog, please," he wheezed, his eyes darting frantically toward the loyalists. "It was just business. It was just a side stream." "I can double the syndicate's profits." Minseog raised the barrel of his weapon, resting the cold steel directly against the center of the traitor's forehead. The pathetic plea died instantly in Elias's throat. "You used my docks. You used my money. You used my name to harvest the forgotten," Minseog said, every word vibrating with a lethal suppressed fury. "Stealing from my vaults is a betrayal of business. I would have just taken your hands for that, but turning my house into a slaughterhouse for children? That is a rot I will not allow to fester." Minseog cocked the hammer. The sharp, mechanical click echoed through the silent warehouse. "There is a price for treason," the untouchable king whispered, his face a mask of carved, unforgiving stone. "But for touching the innocent in my city, there is no price. Key, there is only eradication." Minseog pulled the trigger. The deafening crack severed the last rotten thread of his corrupted empire, leaving the architect of order standing alone in the ruins, finally ready to rebuild. The torrential storms that had washed the city in blood were long gone, replaced by the crisp, biting gold of an autumn afternoon. Minseog Byeon sat in the hushed, climate-controlled sanctuary of his luxury black sedan, the heavy armored doors insulating him from the bustling street outside. His criminal empire was quieter now, running with a new, terrifyingly pure efficiency. The Purge had been swift and absolute. Every street-level jackal, every traitorous lieutenant, and every shadow operation dealing in human misery had been violently eradicated from his territory. The underworld still whispered his name with suffocating fear, but the rules of his flawless machine had fundamentally changed. Touching the innocent in his city was no longer just a violation of business, it was a guarantee of eradication. Minseog shifted slightly against the pristine leather, a dull, phantom ache reminding him of the healing bullet graze beneath his tailored dark overcoat. He kept his dark, evaluating gaze locked on the ornate wrought iron gates of the city's most prestigious private academy across the street. The heavy oak doors of the main hall swung open, spilling a tide of uniformed students onto the manicured courtyard. Among them, two figures stood out to the apex predator, watching from the shadows. Greg walked closely beside his older brother, Leo. The oversized, mud-caked hoodie was gone, replaced by a crisp, wood-tailored blazer and a neatly tied tie. The brutal bruising on Leo's face had faded into faint shadows, and the suffocating hunted terror that had once haunted their eyes was entirely erased. As they walked toward the waiting, heavily guarded escort vehicle Minseog had assigned to them, Greg paused. The 10-year-old boy turned his head, his sharp eyes scanning the line of parked cars, until they locked directly onto the deeply tinted windows of Minseog's flagship sedan. Even through the impenetrable black glass, the boy knew exactly who was watching. Greg didn't wave or smile like an ordinary child. Instead, he stood perfectly still, straightening his posture and offering a small, solemn nod of absolute, uncorrupted respect before climbing into the backseat with his brother. Minseog did not return the gesture, but the icy, emotionless fortress surrounding his heart finally, quietly surrendered. For decades, he had believed that sentiment was a fatal flaw, a structural crack that would inevitably bring his empire crashing down. He had built his entire life on purchased loyalty, rigid discipline, and fear. Yet, as he watched the taillights of the boy's car merge safely into the city traffic, the untouchable Mafia boss realized the profound truth of that rain-soaked night. He hadn't just saved two desperate street kids from the gutters. By throwing his fragile body in front of a moving armored vehicle and standing fearlessly beside him in the blood-slicked kill box, Greg had given Minseog something his wealth and power never could. The boy's raw, fearless devotion had reached into the darkest depths of the underworld and saved the monster from himself.